Welcome, everybody, to the Biblical Roads Gallery. I am your main host tonight, Jonathan Pritchett, here on Trinity Radio, and we have a great lineup for us tonight. First off, we have Will from the Church Split again. How you doing, Will?
Good, man. How are you doing?
I'm all right. We have the apologist in Detroit, Chris Samuel, back to the panel.
With my Plato's Cave Search and Rescue Team shirt on today.
All right. There you go. Go in there and bring out the Platonists. All right. Sounds good. We have the New Testament theologist, Nick Quint. How you doing?
Better than I deserve, everyone. Lovely to see you.
And joining us for the first time on our panel, what has to be the most thorough downgrade from last week's guest, Craig Keener. We have Drew McLeod from the Provisionist Perspective. How you doing?
I'm doing good. How's everybody?
And you promised to be the most useless person on the panel tonight. But we've got some important issues to talk about tonight because we're getting into Romans chapter 1, verses 24 through 32. And most famously in this passage is what is called the clobber verses. So verses 26 and 27 gets a lot of attention and a lot of controversy, and now a lot of debate about what they actually mean. So we're going to jump right into it. Romans chapter 1. And backed by popular demand, since the poll said they wanted us to use the NASB, we're going to be using the NASB. And Will, you haven't read yet, so go ahead and read our text for this evening.
Alrighty. Therefore, God gave them up to vile impurity in the lusts of their hearts, so that their bodies would be dishonored among them. For they exchanged the truth of God for falsehood and worshipped and served the creature rather than the Creator, who is blessed forever. Amen. For this reason, God gave them over to degrading passions, for their women exchanged natural relations for that which is contrary to nature. And likewise, the men, too, abandoned natural relations with women and burned their desire toward one another, males with males, committing shameful acts and receiving in their own persons the due penalty of their error. And just as they did not see fit to acknowledge God, God gave them up to a depraved mind, to do those things that are not proper. People have been filled with all unrighteousness, wickedness, greed, and evil, full of envy, murder, strife, deceit, and malice. They are gossips, slanderers, haters of God, insolent, arrogant, boastful, inventors of evil, disobedient to parents, without understanding, untrustworthy, unfeeling, and unmerciful. And although they know the ordinance of God, that those who practice such things are worthy of death, they not only do the same, but also approve of those who practice them.
Amen. The word of the Lord. Nick, I know that you these are your favorite verses in the entire Bible, but verses 24 through 27 start that motif of the first two of the three God gave them over statements, and the third one being in verse 28. And last week we talked about the first instance of exchange, and now we've got the second and third instances of this idea of exchange, which is another set of three motif that's running through this text. That kind of frames Paul's whole discussion here in some kind of way, doesn't it?
I mean, at least you see what we might call the results of divine activity, divine agency, in response to the disregard of God, what you might call an incipient or at least a Jewish conception of natural theology. But even then, how far do you push that? But yeah, you see God's engaging with sin. And of course, the issue you and I think we'll agree on this, is how do we construct the paradidomi, right? The handing over or the giving over, or how God acts towards folks who have already seemed to have moved away from him. They're not worshiping him. You have idolatry, and maybe that's a good way to frame it, is given idolatry, this seems to be the natural consequence of idolatry, is sexual immorality, which leads into the extended vice list in 28 and following and stuff like that. So you have at the end of this, Very stupidly long statement. You have what is often called a decline of civilization narrative. You have the introduction of the seeds of this that grow into rotten fruit, and eventually it falls down from the tree, and then the tree gets burned up and thrown into the fire in the vice list. And so you have a nice narratival, theological, historical, apocalyptic construction of sin and the results of sin at a cosmological and personal level, fused together by idolatry, sin, and, well, anthropocentrism, as Gentiles are at least primarily in view here, but not exclusively so. So it's an easy passage to interpret.
Yeah, you would think it seemed to be easy for 2,000 some odd years of church history until the sexual revolution, and then all of a sudden it's become the subject of some reinterpretation. But I think the overall point here is when you exchange the truth for a lie and suppress the truth and unrighteousness, when we were talking about originally, there was flickers of the Genesis narrative and the first portion of this, starting with verse 18, but it started to get more prominent with the Genesis creation narrative. And that kind of flies into this, to where however prominent that echo is, it still goes back to this idea of humanity wanting to determine right, good and evil for themselves when they reject what God has made clear to them, whether it's through explicit divine revelation or through even general revelation. It's kind of a recapitulation, and the decline of civilization is a parallel to the fall of humanity in Adam, right?
Yeah, and you see kind of Morna Hooker wrote a really good article. I think it was called Adam in Romans 1, like New Testament studies, very long, like probably 40, 50 years ago, and argued on the basis of all the echoes of, the four-footed beast and the idolatry language. You have maybe echoes of the golden calf incident, or at least the Psalms that kind of reflect that sort of issue. And so together, you get this very Jewish, very explicit articulation of the result of idolatry and paganism, seen from a Jewish apocalyptic perspective, but one that doesn't, of course, end with just a condemnation of pagans or Gentiles. We maybe need to clarify what that is, but one that actually serves a rhetorical purpose, as we'll see in 2 verse 1 later or next week. But that doesn't mean what Paul says here is wrong. It means this is Paul's assertion that he therefore ties everyone into, which is interesting as well.
Yeah. So what is everybody that hasn't spoken besides Nick? what do we make of these phrases? This idea of God giving them over?
I kind of think of it like a parent a lot of times, with the whole idea of like, don't do that, you're going to get hurt. Don't do that, you're going to get hurt. All right, fine. And then letting them actually just go do it, like kind of taking the hands off. Because like oftentimes, like even in the Old Testament, if you look at wrath, the way wrath took place wasn't fire and brimstone. A lot of times it was God just removing like his hand of protection or mercy or blessings from the people, and then letting what happened will take place. And then that would be considered wrathful. So whenever I think of the God gave them over, that's exactly what comes to mind to me. It's just, it seems like it's very reminiscent of, and very, if we can use the term, recapitulating a lot of the same kind of things we see in the Old Testament.
Yeah, he gave them up to the impurity in the lusts of their hearts, so that their bodies would be dishonored among them. I mean, that's pretty. That seems like this idea of God removing his presence, removing his grace, the common grace that we could call it in certain theological circles, of God saying, I'm giving you over to what you're desiring after. This is what you want, so you can have it. That's kind of the sense that I get, that this idea of the things that you're after are, in a sense, both, the cause of God's wrath, but also the response to God's wrath.
Well, and you also have the issue too of when did God hand them over? Because if we're right about the echoes of Genesis 1 throughout this, when did this happen? Is this, you might, and I'm not talking about verb tenses or anything like that, or time. I'm talking about aspects. when Paul says God gave them over, is he talking as kind of the whole construct of history? Like, is he talking about human history and idolatry and sin that kind of recapitulates like epicycles throughout human history? Or is he talking about his present time as he looks at, say, the Roman Empire and their sexual immorality and violence and avarice and stuff like that? My sense is, if by him using the creational narratives, he has kind of the whole of human history and kind of an encyclical cycle of depravity, narcissism, selfishness, sexual immorality, and stuff like that, that gets kind of typified as the Gentile problem, so to speak, or the, you know, by extraction, the human problem. And thus, when God gave them over, you could see echoes of Adam and Eve in there. God gave them over to the desires of their heart when they took from the tree. And so you have that kind of narrative being kind of sewn up there, or at least waiting to be sewn up in Romans 5 and 7 and 8. But you also have the issue of God scattering the nations, you know, hence pagans and Gentiles at Babel. And all, if you bring Heiser into this, and you have all the other aspects of that as well. So in my mind, Paul's telling not just a simple story with an eye towards Rome, although he is looking at the Roman Empire. He's looking, I see this as kind of a commentary on history as sin, right? As one word, history as sin. And kind of using that as a means by which to demonstrate the initial assault on what we might call ethnic privilege that Jewish people seem to be articulating, at least in certain parts of the passages, and then uses that against them to basically say, nope, you're all under the power of sin. Congratulations.
Yeah,
Congratulations,
I would agree.
we're all in the sin here. Just go ahead, Will. Sorry.
No, I would agree with that, because it's mainly, so it starts off in this whole passage, for the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness. So it's kind of like the beginning of the thought that flows into this, because really throughout Romans, he is building an argument, right? And so it seems like to me that he's calling back to that creation narrative, like you said, to be talking about different parts of human history in general, as he builds his case against why the Messianic age, and if you want to get apocalyptic here, you can, but why are these parallels being drawn at all? It just seems like he kind of has to set the groundwork, and this is kind of the beginning of the groundwork.
Well, and you actually have explicit reference to creation, and I'm looking at it, so give me like 2 seconds to try and find it, but there's a very specific anyway, arson. Okay, arson. Okay, yeah. Paul explicit. I don't know if you guys read the commentaries on this, but I went and did my own translational work and was like, oh, that makes sense. I mean, Romans 27 uses specific arson language, you know, male, you know, or Haran language, you know, man as male, and uses the feminine form of that. They're women, right? You know, so thelos or thelus, you know. But that exact construct, male and female, is exactly used in the Genesis 1:26 narrative. And so you have him basically giving a commentary on the degradation of the human person, the dehumanization of humanity, when men exchange natural relations with women, go, you know, men and men, women with women, thereby basically showing the breaking of the covenant, the breaking of humankind, the breaking of God's kind of, you might say, construct of humanity, you know, male and female, he made them. And so I see all this as kind of Paul's bringing everything of creation like Jesus does in Matthew 19, you know, have you not read, you know, sort of thing. So all that, he's basically doing biblical theology and commentary on the history of sin. And it begins with the breakdown of our bodies and our relationships with one another as male and female.
The NASB translates into exchanging the truth for falsehood, but I mean, it's not just any general falsehood. It would be the lie, right? Which
verse? So I can see it. I can't see it.
In verse what is it? Verse 24.
Is that 24? Yeah, right there.
Yeah, I'm looking at it. I'm just looking for the what can we know with the exchange?
I mean, what is
25?
Verse 25.
Yeah, 25. Sorry.
Okay, yeah, that's what was throwing me off. I'm looking for. Yeah, I was looking for a lie in the wrong. I was looking for a lie in the wrong place. Yeah, for the lie. Yeah, I mean it's articular. The issue with Greek definite articles is people tend to overplay them. You know, but I mean it seems to highlight the idea of the truth of God, and so it's not truth about God, but truth of God. That is God's revelatory power, truth. You know, which we would call truth in the lie or through the lie. You know, by means of the lie, they exchanged it. So the lie is the means by which they exchange, or you might say, change or transfer pervert in a colloquial sense. Yeah.
But to go from worshiping the creator to things in creation itself would be the idolatry of that would be the lie, right? That begets everything. Everything flows from the idolatry of creation, right?
It would go ahead.
All the evils that Paul will go on to list, and not just the sexual deviancy, but the evils of, this vice list that comes later in this passage. I mean, all of that flows from idolatry, and the giving them over to their idolatry leads to all of that, right?
I think so, but I would argue that there's a satanic element to it. Otherwise, it makes it kind of odd. I mean, if you're doing biblical theology and reading Romans holistically, I mean, the fact that it ends with with Satan being crushed under the feet of the church in 1620, might give a little bit of a precursor to that. If you're reading Romans, biblical theologically, big picture sort of thing. So I would say yes, the lie, but I would say who told the lie in the first place?
Would you say this lie is a reference to the serpent narrative?
I would say it's too much to say yes and stop. I would say it's an echo. Everything within chapter 1 specifically reverberates with the thunder of Genesis 1 and 2 and 3. Like it's okay. all of the ingredients that we see were shaking in Romans, or shaking in Genesis 1 and 3. And so that's where I kind of focus on. And it's basically everything Paul says is grounded in Old Testament thought, with whether it's the idolatry of Israel in the land, with the golden calf, but also the language of Paul uses this text elsewhere in Galatians. They stood up to play, engaged in revelry and stuff like that, sexual immorality. And so it's a very interesting. It's a cacophony, or it's like going into an old abandoned church with stained glass, wood, and you have your child play the organ. The whole place thunders with the echoes of Genesis 1, 2, and 3. And I can say that as someone who serves as pastor of a church that has the same sort of organ and has a son who discovered that one day and scared the living what out of me at 8:00 at night when it was dark in there, and he just decided to run up and play it. So, but imagine that is the image. And every Jew and every Gentile, and I should clarify, you have pagans who are non-Christians and Gentiles who are Christians. So when I say pagan, I'm thinking non-Christian Gentile. And that's how I think Paul uses ethnos, or ethnoi, Gentile.
Yeah.
But every Gentile who's been converted probably has heard of Israel's story enough, and every Jew is hearing this echo and going like, "Oh, we'll explain that to you later. Don't worry, keep listening." So it's meant to be heard.
But specifically in this text, the giving up is to the vile impurity and the lusts of their hearts, so that their bodies would be dishonored. Of course, we have the shame language there that would be very familiar to everyone, Jew or Greek, in a first century context of honor, shame. So it's specifically pointing out the bodies there, and then the exchange of the truth of falsehood, worshipped and served the creature rather than the creator. So that brings up that distinction between the creation, the creature and the creator, and reversing what should belong to God. And so Paul throws in a little benediction right there in the middle of this passage, who is blessed forever, that would compound the shame of what he's going into, to give that little, because it just doesn't say serve the creature rather than the creator. And for this reason, I mean, he throws in that benediction to remind, I guess, the readers that humanity has gotten this backwards, but it is God, and we need, he is to be blessed forever. Amen. Not the other way around, not the creature to be worshiped and served.
Well, and that's where you get the language of the minds being darkened, but also you have, and this might get me in trouble with a few folks, not with anyone here. You get this issue of human agency involved. They exchanged, they did, they, in these verbs kind of compounding on that. Therefore, God gave them over as a response to human, what we might call indeterminate acts, which tells us that already these acts of rebellion are not pre-orchestrated or preordained, because God's response is not to construct it, but to basically allow the deconstruction to continue by essentially shoving them into sin. Basically, go for it. And so it's both active and passive. God is not the one actively inflicting it. God is the one basically saying, fine, I'm going to let the dogs loose and you guys can figure it out. Chris, you are thinking, and your beard is looking especially fine today, unlike Will's and mine. So what are your thoughts?
Oh no, I don't have much to add up at this point. I think you and Will kind of touched on the area where I was thinking. I do think
frame that, Will. By the way, you and Nick and Will did something great. Frame that and put that on your wall.
Yeah, but thinking of it sort of a parent turning it over, and then a lot of what you said kind of resonated with me. So yeah, I don't have much to contribute at this point, but we'll get there.
Judicial heart, was that the phrase, Pritchett? Judicial heart. I didn't get to see the comment. That's
what Leighton Flowers calls it, judicial hardening.
I don't see judicial language in there at all. So I wouldn't call it that.
Now, I feel like the reason why I've always avoided the judicial hardening statement is like more and more is mainly because of that. It sounds like you are like, well, I'm actually purposely hardening your heart now against it to judge you, where I think it's better to say like what Paul says here, which is he gave them up.
Well, yeah, but I would say, going into verses 25 and 26, which everyone wants to hear what we have to say about those verses, but going into that, when you talk about there is condemnation language here, which is judicial, I think.
No, it's not. Those are not the same things.
Well, we can.
No, I mean they're not. They're just not. I mean, but they can be put together, but they're not the same. Wrath has a very explicit, like wrath in the Old Testament and the New Testament can be used in a law court or a judicial context, but here it's not a judicial context. It's a decline of civilization narrative. It's a vice list. That's not the same as a law court. It's like I think you can see that in Romans 3, perhaps. The forensic language, or even the imputation language is not quite right, but the language in Romans 4. But that's not. This is not a law court. This is a tapestry of history. It's a narrative of broken relationships and sin, not broken laws in the sense of a law court. I'm sorry, I just disagree. So I guess I just don't see the need for calling it judicial hardening when the very first word is irrelevant to the actual narrative and apocalyptic context. But I've been wrong about things. So,
and granted, there are times where Paul explicitly calls something like a hardening. So I mean, I think there's. So my point is, I'm just like, I think it's best to, because that's for me, it just gets murky. Like there can be a lot of things can be misunderstood. So I just try to be a bit more precise with some of the language. Anyway,
I don't know. It sounds. I mean, I agree that chapter 3, it's more explicit judicial law court language, but I think there's flickers of that here. And of course, in chapter 2, it does talk about the day of judgment, and then of course he's already mentioning, receiving the due penalty of their error, and then goes in to talk about being worthy of death. So I mean, those are punishments. So I don't know that you can get away from that language as being judicial in all respects.
I think
I don't have a strong opinion on it either way.
Go ahead,
something
Drew.
important to note too regarding judicial hardening is that it's, as far as I understand it, it's usually temporary and redemptive. Like I've thought before, like, oh, maybe we could call it redemptive hardening, because the whole purpose of, for instance, I mean, you see this later on in Romans 9 with Pharaoh. The purpose of hardening Pharaoh's heart was so that Yahweh's name would be proclaimed in all the earth. So it's a redemptive manner in the way in which this happens. So I don't necessarily have a problem with judicial in the sense that not like a judge or a court, and I'm not all up on kind of some of this terminology that you guys are using, but that God's doing this in such a way that is simultaneously like what you said, Jonathan, which is coming to this penalty of their error, death, and stuff. But
Paul
says can have redemptive, right? I'm just saying the point that you pointed it out,
And again, in the very next chapter, in verse 4, is God's kindness and patience is to lead people towards repentance, withholding that judgment that goes on the day of wrath. Right? I mean, I see it as judicial.
That's wage language, Jonathan. That's wage language. I'm looking at the Greek text. That's not due penalty. That's wage language. Recompense, exchange, penalty. That's wage, like mythos, like anti-mythos say. Like that's wage language. That's like Romans 6:23 language. The wages of sin being death. Like that's we're talking economics here, and we're an economic metaphor, but that's not judicial or anything like that. That's economic. That's based on ethics or morality, not based on law.
I was saying I'm not against it because it's leading into chapter 2.
How would you connect? Speaking of chapter 2, like how would you connect in terms of the flow of thought here? End of Romans 1, and then into this. Therefore, every one of you judges is without excuse, and then it talks about the in verse 5, because of your hardened and unrepentant heart, you're storing up wrath for yourself in the day of wrath, for when God's righteous judgment is revealed. How does that connect? Or because I guess what maybe Jonathan is saying and what I'm seeing is that there are no chapter divisions, so somehow this connects. And if it's not kind of like a judgment in the previous part, how does that flow into this, if that makes any sense? I don't know if the question is particularly clear.
I mean, he starts to engage an imaginary interlocutor to give a kind of a clear demarcation that he's switching gears, because he starts to all you pass judgment against them, you're guilty of the same things, to let you know that this is why a lot of people think that he's switching gears from what seems to have been, and we talked about this last week, a fairly standard Jewish polemic against the Gentile world. And then he turns that around and starts pointing the fingers at the Jewish believers who could amen everything he said up until verse 32. But then he does that, and all of that does lead into the catena of chapter 3, and then the apocalypse for Nick of in verse 31. So I'm not sold on that there's absolutely nothing about judicial language brimming in the background at this point, because even if you don't call it judicial, it's still this giving them over is a consequence, right? So it is consequential in that sense, and it could be in a sense of withholding, or whatever, pulling back God's presence, letting them go their own way. Because I do like what Nick was saying about this is just as they were actively suppressing the truth, they were actively making this exchange of that truth for the falsehood, and engaging all these degrading passions and all of that we'll get into. Because I mean, Paul goes into verse 26 and says it is for this reason God gave them over to the degrading passions, which is echoing what he's already said about their vile impurity and the lusts of their hearts, so that their bodies would be dishonored and shameful. And then goes into verse 26. So I don't know, maybe a topic for another time.
Okay.
How much judicial stuff is involved here, but I'm not opposed to the language of judicial hardening, though I kind of agree with Will that there is specific contexts in which that makes more sense than others. But I think what Paul's or what Leighton goes into with Paul, that I think he relates that more to like Jewish unbelief, right?
Right. I mean, the only reason why, like I said, I tend to try to skirt the issue, and I'll only use it for people who tend to be familiar with what I might be referring to, is mainly just because it feels like such a loaded term that as soon as you use it, suddenly everyone's like, what do you mean by judicial? What do you mean by hardening? And then you have to just chase 100 rabbits down different holes. So I just try to avoid that.
Yeah, because even that hardening language, if you accept the standard interpretation, of chapter 2 being a turnabout is fair play against the Jews kind of thing. That hardening language is once again used for the Jews, whereas this is kind of a standard. And I think we all agreed last week, and Craig Keener agreed that Paul has already put in the hints against the critique of the Jews in the next chapter already in this chapter. And so, or in this section of 18 through 32. So it's not like it should be all of that unexpected, that critique comes for this, because it's kind of buried in there, especially when it gets into the vice list, because certainly Jews would would be susceptible to those, even if not for verses 26 and 27, which we probably need to go ahead and get into. I'll read it again. For this reason, God gave them over to degrading passions. For their women exchanged the natural relations for what is contrary to nature. And likewise, the men too abandoned natural relations with women and burned in their desire toward one another, males with males, committing shameful acts and receiving in their own persons the due penalty of their error. That sounds pretty harsh. I mean, Paul doesn't really pull any punches there. Nick, you had already mentioned he uses the male language and female language that echoes the Genesis 1:26 and 27, and sees this as a reversal of the created order that God had intended. And that's where that language of against nature or contrary to nature comes from.
Yeah, there's that, and there's also what I'm trying to get at is verse 24. You have the dishonoring of their bodies. That is something they do of themselves. It was already kind of in their hearts to do it, idolatry and all that sort of stuff. And here you have the same sort of language of metalasso, to exchange or what have you here. Basically what I'm seeing throughout this passage, specifically as it relates to human agency, is you have men doing this with one another, women doing this with one another as kind of a demonstration of God basically stepping back, and kind of letting the fire run its course. So I think one of the issues here is is ethics. How do we understand it in that sort of sense, but also the issue of human agency as it relates to all of this. And for example, you'll read specific scholars. Oh, I won't get into that. We'll get into that in the hermeneutical section towards the end. But one of the things that I was struck by is the language of that, but also the language of mutuality here. It very much is reflective of the one another that we see throughout Paul's letters. Bear one another's burdens, have this sort of positive constructs or utilizations of the reciprocal pronoun and stuff like that. You have that, and you can even see that in Ephesians chapter 5. Submitting to one another out of reverence for Christ, and you have this sort of what human relationships are meant to be in terms. Sexuality is a big part of this, obviously. Exchanging desire and going and doing all that. You have this sort of, and Paul, you have this sort of construct of where mutuality between husband and wife are male and female. Specifically, it is male and female language, not even husband and wife language per se. As it relates to that, where there's harmony, here you have disharmony between not only male and female, but just men and women, period. And that leads to degrading, dishonor, brokenness in the relationship, which is contrary to Genesis 1. Specifically, God made them in his image, male and female. He made them to have dominion over creation rather than to worship creation. And so you have basically this the undoing of creation. What I'm not sure, that's a take I heard Heiser use one time. I used it before him, but or before I heard him say it, so I can claim that. But that idea of the undoing or the dehumanization of humanity, leading to sexual immorality, vice, brokenness, all that sort of stuff, and that's of human origin. Specifically, I would argue of satanic origin, with human beings being the willing participants in that sort of reality. And so I was just struck by that. If that's the case, and my take is correct, and that undoes this being between masters and slaves, being between parties who are hierarchically ordered, that sort of stuff, boys and men. It actually seems to utilize language of mutuality in a, you might say, a flipped sense, a twisted sense, an exchanged sense.
Right.
And so I was just kind of struck by that sort of image that I'd seen before and hadn't really talked about.
Paul certainly doesn't exclude any of those things. Like he doesn't, he condemn, he brings up the just male with male, female with female sexual immorality, and that would subsume master slave. It would subsume pederasty, prostitution. All of that is included, but the arguments that this is limited to those things, like power dynamics or whatever, doesn't hold water, because actually Paul doesn't mention it. Pederastia, he could have said that if that's what he meant, right?
He could have, but you also. Oh, go ahead. Well, I've been talking a lot. Go ahead.
No. I was gonna go down the Leviticus 18 trail for a minute, but but I don't want to get us sidetracked. Are you good for a second or no?
Yeah, go for it. Yeah.
I'm good.
Okay. Because one of the things is, if we're talking about how this is a recapitulation of things like in Genesis, right? The creative order is a decreation, if you will, like you were talking about. And we oftentimes hear, and we'll probably talk about this throughout, that the progressives will say this is dealing with like pedophilia, or this is dealing with, like, as I said, power dynamics, even though that's not anywhere in here. Power dynamics aren't. So what comes to mind here, or did you groan? Thought I heard you groan.
Well, when you said this text isn't about power dynamics, it is playing off of power dynamics, but not in the way the progressives would like.
Right,
but,
right.
We'll save that for later.
Okay. Yes. So, but obviously he's also making a connection to something like Leviticus 18:22, of course, which says that you shall not lie with a male as one lies with a female. It is an abomination. So because one of the things we forget is that he was a Pharisee. So he was very Jewish. And so he would hold the Torah to actually a pretty high esteem and the laws there. And what people oftentimes miss is the fact that the Septuagint, so the Greek translation of the Old Testament, uses a similar word in the Greek. We'll talk about probably arsenokoitai and arsenokoites and all that here in a minute. But what's interesting is that even in the Hebrew itself, in this section, we have the one for male, which is like Zachariah, I think is how it's pronounced. And then we have Isha. And what's funny is that Isha means female generally, and Zachariah means male generally. In other words, human and animal alike, all male and all female. So let's talk about a general categories here. If even in the Hebrew, if it wanted to refer to a boy child, it would say Yaled. In the female, it would be Nakiba. Girl child would be Yalda, youth. Like a teenage boy would be Na'ar, and a teenage woman or young woman would be Alma. So in other words, Hebrew is a specific language, and even if you try to bring that, because I've seen people try to do that also in Leviticus 18, and it doesn't work either. So the language just also doesn't hold up, because there are specific words for all these different things, and he uses the general male and the general female.
Well, and arson, that's the same word, or the very same different form of the word, but that's what we find in Romans 1:27. Men, arson, or haran here, forms the bedrock of that very interesting lexeme arsenokoite. So it's male, man as male, as the tradition might have us say. But before I forget, if that's okay, you mentioned power in Romans 1. It's interesting here. You'll see my progressive brothers and sisters talk about imbalance of power dynamics and stuff like that. If you look at ancient texts, and Pritchett, I don't know if we were going into this, I didn't see the PowerPoint. Lesbianism, by and large, was very much not affirmed as a thing in the ancient world, and part of that was misogynistic. You had that aspect of it. Men could do basically, kind of generally speaking, could do kind of whatever they wanted as long as it wasn't with another Roman citizen. If there was a slave, or what have you, they had a lot of free reign, slave, child, all that sort of stuff. Their sexual ethics were as wide and as diverse as ours in the United States. And so you've got this sort of idea here. The fact that Paul indicts lesbianism specifically, this is the one instance in the New Testament where explicit reference in the New Testament is shocking to them, because his Greco-Roman counterparts would actually probably agree with him on that point. But the fact that he includes it shows, I would argue, his sexually egalitarian ethic. The fact that he indicts both male and female and uses both as examples of the degradation of humankind illustrates Genesis 1, where you're supposed to be in harmony with one another. And here you've broken the harmony, you've fallen into disarray, you've actually fallen, ironically, I'd say you've fallen into Greco-Roman values instead of Jewish values, or Jewish Christian values, Jesus values, we might say. And so he is playing with power. In that sense, he is playing with the conception of Greco-Roman power and hierarchy, but by indicting both male and female equally, he is basically taking Greco-Roman power and throwing it down the toilet.
Being very egalitarian of Paul, very egalitarian.
Well, Paul, when it comes to condemnation, Paul is egalitarian, and when it comes to affirmation, Paul is egalitarian. He has no problem condemning men and women. I don't know why people have a problem with that. But here, specifically, by including women in this,
modern pastors have a problem condemning men and women, but Paul didn't have a problem doing it.
Right.
Actually, so it's funny you say that, because last night I just covered on the church split. There was a pastor in North Carolina that actually said that if a woman is wearing short shorts and she gets raped, that the man should go free. Like, he actually said that. I have it on tape. You can watch it on our channel. It's bonkers.
Why are the only words that are
Drew's response is, why'd it have to be North Carolina?
Well, first of all, yes, that's my home state. And then second of all, why do all of the statements from pastors that are directed towards the particular sins of women have to be so completely off the wall, bonkers crazy like this?
I have no idea, man. But it was one of those things where, like, again, right here, his statement's obviously unbiblical, because sexual immorality, no matter which way you slice it.
Yeah. Well, that kind of statement from those fundamentalist pastors that's clout chasing. They do that to get the kind of responses you probably gave them at this point, because they know social media exists now and all that. So they know, and if they're videotaping it, they know that that's what they're going to get. You
give him way too much credit, because he issued an apology letter and hasn't showed up to his church since.
Oh.
These guys don't know how the internet works yet. It's actually kind of funny.
Yeah. Back to what Nick was saying, though. There's that quote from Plutarch, Amatorius, line. What is it? 761E. Women have no part in Aries at all, but the possession by love induces them to dare to do something beyond nature and to die. So, I mean, it's not unheard of that, lesbian activity, but it was, like you said, it was frowned upon, because the male dominated culture of the time looked upon it with disdain themselves. But Paul decided to include that, which I think is, quite telling, because it's, like I said, it's quite egalitarian for him to dunk on that behavior as well as the men. Because you don't find a whole lot of statements about that kind of behavior at all, because they considered it shameful, and they just kind of not much of an issue for them. But also, given how it wasn't, that was a very taboo thing, even though homosexual behavior with regards to men was not taboo. It was, some Romans frowned upon it, some Greeks frowned upon it, but generally it was just kind of a standard practice, especially and while pederasty was the main form of that expression, that it certainly wasn't exclusive to that. And Paul comes down on it pretty hard. So I think it's inescapable. This behavior is contrary to God's design, and that should be obvious from creation, and that it is described pretty harshly. I mean, it's for both male with male and female with female. It's vile impurity in the lust. Their bodies are dishonored, degrading passions, contrary to nature, abandon the natural relations, burned in their desire, shameful acts. And then, of course, later on, due penalty of their error. This is not like, I know in typical sermons these days, the instinct is to try to softball this issue and then say, and by the way, heterosexual sins outside of marriage and God's design is also bad, and try to soften this language. We soften in a lot of contemporary churches. I mean, far from Christians being so ugly and hateful to homosexuality, they go out of their way to where they even lose the biblical statements and the biblical standard about this to try to soft pedal what Paul certainly isn't soft pedaling here.
Well, and he's probably got gay people in his churches. We know he does in Corinth. And it's one of those where Paul preaches this sort of stuff to people who've repented of their sins and are full functioning members of, Corinth, full functioning is probably not the best term for that church specifically, right. But certainly
dysfunctioning.
Yeah, but certainly people within the church that need some correction, we might say. But point being, I think it's one of those things where people have forgotten the true nature of Greco-Roman power and violence and avarice, because at the end of the day, we don't think about where we live. And if you look at the United States right now in terms of sexual ethics, we are very much in line with the Greco-Roman Empire. In fact, we're probably as bad as them. And so when I tell people that, I kind of go, look outside. Like, this is not new. The culture, and I'll sound like Greg Coco when I say it, the culture says, but culture, if you look at culture, we're dealing with, and people are recognizing this, young people especially, that we're dealing with a world that is fundamentally broken. And I think younger people are actually starting to kind of grasp that. They understand that there are demonic powers, there are things that go bump in the night, there are things that they know they shouldn't be doing. And rather than dealing with atheists, as if that's kind of the thing, we need to start thinking about what we're dealing with as all theists, that we're so inculcated with Greco-Roman values and entities that the Greco-Roman values and gods are kind of making a comeback. And of course, our solution is, well, we colonized you through the ethics of Jesus Christ, and we still survive and you don't. So we'll do it again if we have to. But that involves preaching to the culture, but also preaching confession, repentance, and love and mercy. And I think you preach both of those as strongly to people that need to hear it, and you won't have a problem, at least in a biblical, healthy worldview sense.
Yeah, one of the things to point out though is for the power dynamics, especially in the Greco-Roman culture, for a lot of the Christians in Rome specifically, where there's a higher population of slavery, there's probably a good number of slaves in the various house churches around Rome who would have been objects of exploitation, of sexual exploitation, both male and female slaves.
Most of the names in Romans 16 probably are slave names, according to Robert Jewett.
Yeah, and so they would probably, in terms of those kind of the sexual perversions that people did with slaves, both male and female, to see this kind of condemnation and a callback to the male and the man will leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two will become one flesh. And that's the original design for biblical marriage. And I know people can bring up polygamy and everything else, but that never ends well for anybody involved if you read the narratives. So God's design is one man, one woman. They become one flesh because they came from one flesh, and then in the sexual union they become one flesh. And that seems to be the design that God has from the first pages of the Bible. And so for these people who have been sexually exploited, some sort of return to that norm within the Christian community is a safe community for them, and to know that God's wrath is has been revealed from heaven against this kind of behavior is probably some sense of justice that the members of the church who have come out of that kind of sexual exploitation would find comfort in, that God has wrath against this kind of behavior, even if the Greco-Roman culture doesn't.
More specifically, God standing on the side of the actual sexually exploited, the powerless ones, whom God actually says the wrath of God is being revealed against all unrighteousness and includes human agency, but it doesn't talk about, or it doesn't condemn those who are exploited by this. And so Paul, and the wrath of God is revealed against ungodliness. Ungodliness requires ungodly people to be doing something, but it doesn't condemn those who are victims of ungodliness or unrighteousness. And so it's interesting too. A slave who's a victim of exploitation would hear these passages and wouldn't see himself or herself under the rubric of condemnation. They would see themselves as, well, I'm in a place now where this is being condemned by a holy, wrathful God who sees what is happening to me, is on my side. And then, of course, the slave language throughout Romans becomes a lot more personal, because they are hearing this and going like, God is on the side of the victimized, the broken, and is against the ones who are lawless, powerful, and deceitful and oppressive. And so it's kind of one of those implicit warnings against this behavior. Anyone who's doing this, the wrath of God is against you. And the slave, he or she is given a sort, not a pass, but is given refuge. And that's what the nature of the church is. The church is a place of refuge against this sort of ungodliness.
Yeah. And so let's get into this language about
hey, Bridget, someone said that before you talk. So if someone wants
that was me.
Go ahead.
I didn't know whether or not you guys talked about this, but in your previous streams, but I appreciated the fact that people have been saying that God's wrath has been revealed against the sin, against the ungodliness. because in our podcast, you know us, God's love and provision for everyone. And there's a sense in which people think that like God has this wrathful abiding upon the person, but primarily that's directed towards their sin and their ungodliness. So I think that that's like a really important nuance in this conversation. And I guess I just wanted to comment on the cultural, like this cultural moment that you guys said earlier. We've seen people that are seeing the demonic nature of this sexual immorality and these issues in our culture. Like, what's that guy's name? Is it Awaken with Jay? Is it Jay? Is that his name? That recently came to Christ because he was seeing all of this basically depravity in the culture. And he said, man, there's a God, so this must be the evil part. Let me just move away from this. And as he was moving away from it, he was moving more into a conservatism and then became a Christian. And I thought that was really interesting in terms of this cultural moment and how some people are responding. Not to say that conservatism is the gospel, but it's just interesting his testimony as to how he ended up believing and trusting in Christ. So I thought that was. Do you guys know who I'm talking about?
No, but I know I know stories like that.
He's a real popular YouTuber, and he often like makes fun of leftists and progressives with sketches and stuff like that. It's Awaken with JP. JP is his name. Awaken with JP.
The second JP, not the cool JP.
Yeah, yeah. JP, the ginger JP.
Yeah, the objections from the more progressive crowd, which, by the way, there is a number of pro LGBTQ affirming, pro gay marriage, pro liberal theology, atheist. There is a lot of biblical scholarship that is for all of that, who reject the progressive arguments against like they try to come up with these ideas that Paul wasn't talking about like homosexuals. He didn't have an idea of orientation, but there was ideas about people who had stronger proclivities towards men. It's not like the idea rather than women. It's not like that idea was foreign in the ancient world. And so we could talk about just the acts, but even these acts come from lustful desires and things like that. So I know there's a lot of talk about, well, just being same-sex attraction is not a sin. It's only the activity of it. But I mean, that whole desire is out of line with the design. And I know it's not a popular thing to say. But Paul, he's pretty explicit here. And this can't be just about pederasty, because even though that was the most common, that wasn't the only form of homosexual, behavior in the ancient world. Paul mentions women. And so for pederasty, it's unheard of. There's for all the extant texts that we have, there's no woman girl pederasty going on, right? That there just wasn't a thing. If that's what Paul specifically had in mind, that wouldn't be what he would not have even mentioned the women thing.
Well, it's just weird too, because it's oh, go ahead, Will.
Oh no, just pederasty. The act of pederasty was very normal, from grooming young boys, turning them into eunuchs, trying to prevent any kind of puberty so that way they keep their young youthfulness. All that was very normal for boys, but as you mentioned before, it wasn't normal for young ladies. Go ahead, Nick.
Well, I was just going to say too, if you read something like Plato's Symposium, I went back and reread it. It's like Pausanias and all these different speakers. It's just it's one of the more just like Aristophanes and all them in there. It's just, and I know Pritchett, you've read all this, but it's interesting just how much they talk about, and it's one of those things. I think I just fundamentally object to the idea that loving gay relationships only popped into existence in the 1960s. Rome was as cosmopolitan, as affluent, as diverse as Los Angeles or Dallas or Houston or whatever. Like the fact that homosexuals only gay folk only discovered that they could love each other when we had 1950s America is just absurd. I mean, if you just read Plato's Symposium, you find some of the most moving in a literary sense, some of the most moving material just written about homosexual love and, male soldiers and the Greek and Plato and stuff like that. You read it and it's like it's narrative and it's speeches, and it's actually quite moving in just kind of a literary sense. And it's like the idea that Paul would not know about genuine, loving, what we would call today loving, consenting relationships, assumes that all relationships in the ancient world were by nature exploitative and pederastic. And I'm like, one, Paul doesn't say that, and two, we know that's not true, and two, we can see, but just by basis of the evidence, that there are these relationships. They're well known. Sometimes they're mocked by the satirists, but oftentimes they're simply accepted. And the idea that Paul wouldn't know that is just so historically, like, what's a good word that's not a naughty word that's going to get me banned? It's so historically dumb that whenever someone says that, I'm like, we're not having a serious conversation here. It's like saying you believe in three gods. If saying something to a Trinitarian, it's like, okay, like, shut the laptop. I'm going to go work out or go have a drink. Like, I'm done.
Yeah, do something more productive with your time, because I mean, you're right. They have, I think it was Plato and a few others. There's like record of like actual lesbian, like, adult women living together. There we have it on pottery of like romantic, like, relations with two men. This whole idea, like you said, that this is like a foreign concept to Paul, this outside of some group of pederasty or some slave owner taking advantage of, that's just not true. Just blatantly not true.
Yeah,
I mean, here I could read it. This is from Gagnon. I could read it. This is from Callicratides in Plato's Symposium, and it's in Gagnon's book 356 and 357. He says, and I'm not going to read the Greek text, and there's some stuff in here I'm like, I'm not sure I'm going to say that without laughing, because I have a juvenile sense of humor, so humor me on this. But he's talking about a selfless and self-sacrificial love he has from an older lover. So he says, who would not be a lover of such a young man? And ephebos, so someone who's probably 18 or so ish, and who could not have eye beam so blind and have reasoning faculty so maimed? And how could one not love a Hermes in the wrestling schools, and an Apollos with the lyre, and a horseman like Castor, and one who pursues divine virtues by means of a mortal body? But as for me, O divine powers of heaven, may my life be continuously this, to sit right opposite my dear friend, and to hear him speaking pleasantly nearby, and to go out with him when he goes out, and to have joint involvement, koinonia, in every activity, so that any lover might well pray that the one of whom he is fond shall travel through life without stumbling and without swerving unsteadily, reaching old age without sorrow, and after having experienced from no fate malicious abuse. But if indeed, because of the law of human nature, disease should lightly touch him, I shall be sick with him when he is ill, and I shall sail with him when he sets out through stormy sea. Yeah. Such things apparently did exist to modern progressive historians. I'm so sick of this historical crap. Be honest with the text.
Yeah, well, in fact, there are homosexual biblical scholars that agree with you. One such is Bernadette Bruton, who says, I believe that Paul used the word exchange to indicate that people knew the natural sexual order of the universe and left it behind. I see Paul as condemning all forms of homoeroticism as the unnatural acts of people who have turned away from God. And then there's also a quote here that she dunks on the idea that this is to do with pederasty, or, so she says Paul's just condemning the behavior. And this is someone who is pro LGBT. She's a liberal.
She's a liberal scholar. Yeah.
Yeah. But she's saying, look, you can't get out of this, there's the argument that because he's talking about nature, there's the argument that, well, Paul's not condemning all homosexual behavior or homosexual activity. He's condemning heterosexuals who engage in homosexual behavior because it's against their nature, but it's not against the nature of someone who is already homosexual.
Well, and here's Luke Timothy Johnson, himself a liberal, a very good Roman Catholic Pauline scholar. This is from chapter 2, called The Canonical Paul, volume 2, specifically interpreting Paul. And this book is from how long ago? 2021. So this is a good, up-to-date book. He says, that said, on page 319, that said, the statements on same-sex practice in Leviticus and Paul represent, if we exclude the ambiguous story of David and Jonathan, smart, the sum total of scriptural testimony, and it is entirely negative. Unlike the case of Paul's language with regards to gender, I disagree with that. Contemporary readers find no wiggle room in the canonical letters to support any positive valuation of homoeroticism. From the perspective of Paul the Jew, same-sex practice appeared to be a freely chosen vice, found only among Gentiles and attributed entirely to the effects of idolatry. I don't know if I'd say entirely, but I'd say primarily to the effects of idolatry. At the exegetical level, continue on page 320, no relief is to be found by appealing to the subtle nuances of terms. Paul knew what he saw and did not like it and said so. I don't agree with the did not like it. I think he's shortchanging Paul. Done and done. And then he goes on to talk about biblical literasts and basically makes his case against it from that perspective. But he's honest with the text. I have all the time in the world for people who are honest with the text of Scripture. And then we talk about, as I've said earlier, hermeneutics and the relevance of the Bible as it relates to this actual topic.
Yeah.
So that's where the honest conversation, I think, begins.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of liberal scholars have to come to grips with the fact that the biblical text doesn't support the progressive ideas about the biblical text. And this idea that you already dealt with the fact that Paul understood homosexual orientation. And so that argument has an implicit statement saying, well, there are certain, you're trying to argue that there are certain homosexual acts that Paul would be okay with because he's only talking about heterosexuals who go against their personal nature, but that's not what Paul's talking about here with respect to nature. But worse than that, that would mean that there were acceptable parameters for people to be engaged in greed and evil and envy and murder and strife and deceit and malice and gossiping and slander. There would be acceptable, but that would be ridiculous to assert that. So it's ridiculous to assert that there are acceptable parameters for homosexual activity, that Paul's not broadening it to the activity itself.
Well, and you also have the issue of reinterpreting or reimagining these texts to say something they do not say is, I think, to adopt. I mean, it's an oppressive imperialistic posture. It's hermeneutical colonization by basically saying these texts cannot say what they clearly seem to say. And so what we do, what progressive Christians are doing, is hermeneutical colonization. In fact, it's anti-Semitic. I'm being obviously a little snarky with how I say that. But if you think about it, for the church to revise Scripture and affirm same-sex erotic relationships is to accept that the Roman imperial sexual powers were right and Jesus Christ and the apostles were wrong. And they're asking us to baptize Greco-Roman power and call it holy. And it's one of those things where I'm like, I'm sorry, like, that's colonialism. If we're going by modern day standards, that is colonialism. And I'm sorry, like, I'm not a colonialist. Paul said what he said, and I just have to accept that. I don't have to make Paul say anything else. I don't need to colonize Paul and change him to. Anyway,
and the other reality is, when you said it's anti-Semitic, you're absolutely 100% right, because there is not a single rabbi in antiquity who would agree with any form of their interpretation, and there is not a single early church father you will ever find, or early church teaching whatsoever, that would agree with that teaching either. So again, Pritchett and I have talked about this before, but the church is not the bad guys in this situation. To demand that the church changes its teaching that doesn't suddenly make us the bad guys when we go, no, this is just what the church has always taught, because we believe in a ontological created order between men and women. That it is not somehow making us the bad guys just because we will not change our mind on it.
Yeah,
we believe when God created the world, he did so and called it good. He didn't call it anything else. He called it good, and that was the whole of creation. So we need to really wrestle with that.
So he didn't make Adam and Steve.
Wow, going back to the 80s with that one.
I'll say it, MJ. What a lot of progressive scholars are doing is what did you say? I'll say it, MJ. You said it to me. It is what was it? Sexual white supremacy. Sexual white interpretive supremacy. That's what it is.
Yeah. I mean, I'm not trying to use that as a bludgeon, but I mean, look what I don't want to make this political. So
dude,
I'm gonna take a deep breath.
I did that like 30 minutes ago.
But look
what
I'm
wearing my Clinton shirt, so
look what our current administration tried to do to an African nation a few months ago. They won't keep that same energy with those Arab nations.
Well, think about what the United Methodist Church tried to do to Africa fairly recently and couldn't do because of the Orthodox in Africa basically saying, we got our Bibles and you're not going to colonize us.
But to your point about the anti-Semitic, the anti-Semitic divorce of not only the Jewish Jesus, but the Jewish Paul. Paul was a good Jew, and he's drawing from the holiness code. And a lot of times how these modern progressive interpreters will try to get around that is, of course, well, he was just talking about pagan temple practices. And so that begs the question, that raises certain questions that, okay, is screwing a horse okay outside of the temple? Now, I'm not a Jeff Durbin fan.
Getting demonetized in 3, 2, 1.
I'm not a Jeff Durbin fan, but that question was never answered. I mean, it was just like, oh, you're being silly. No, that is a legitimate, logical question based on your logic.
Now, yeah, I haven't read too deeply, but is there some sort? Well, and again, I want to remind our audience that there are progressive scholars that also are LGBTQ affirming that aren't buying the other progressives on this stuff. There's a number of them. And I think they're all, I think Dr. Brown catalogs them. Dr. Gagnon catalogs some of them as well in their books. But also, where is all of this eisegetical gymnastics taking place for Josephus or for Philo? We have some quotes from them. And why do not the Eleans and Thebans abolish that unnatural and imprudent lust which makes them lie with males? For they will not shew sufficient sign of their repentance of what they of old thought to be very excellent and very advantageous in their practices, unless they entirely avoid all such actions for the time to come. Nay, such things are inserted into the body of their laws, and had once such a power among the Greeks that they ascribed these sodomitical. And yes, sodomy has been a reference to homosexual behavior long before it's just about hospitality. No, it's about a lot more than that. Sodomy has been a reference to homosexual since the 1st century. Sodomitical practices to the gods themselves. And we'll get into Zeus and his Ganymede incident. Plato will talk about that here in a minute. But they ascribe these sodomitical practices to the gods themselves as part of their good character. And indeed, it was according to the same manner that the gods married their own sisters. So the homosexual male thing, they akin to incest. This the Greeks contrived as an apology for their own absurd and unnatural pleasures. That's Josephus. And then, of course, Philo goes on to say, incapable of bearing satiety, plunging like cattle, they threw off from their necks the law of nature and applied themselves to deep drinking of strong liquor and dainty feeding of forbidden forms of intercourse. Not only in their mad lust for women did they violate the marriages of their neighbors, but also men mounted males without respect for the sex nature, which the attractive partner shares with the passive. And so when they did, they tried to beget, he's being sarcastic here, they tried to beget children. They were discovered to be incapable of any but a sterile seed. Yet the discovery availed them not. So much stronger was the force of the lust which mastered them. That's Philo and on Abraham. And he's mocking the Greek culture on this. This is not limited to Paul, and these are also Jews. And of course, Josephus gets bagged on for being an apology for the Romans, but he's still
it kind of was. Let's be real,
right? But he's still here dunking on the Greco-Roman practice of
you can take the Jew out of the Roman Empire, but he's just right. He's still got that view.
And you had mentioned the symposium earlier, but Plato's Laws. He also makes that statement about nature versus contrary to nature, and there's no arguing here that what Plato means by nature is just merely customs or habits, because it was the custom or habit of the Greeks to do this. And he says, and whether one makes the observation in earnest or in jest, one certainly should not fail to observe that when male unites with female for procreation, the pleasure experience is held to be due to nature, but contrary to nature when male mates with male, or here we go, he's egalitarian Plato, female with female, and that those first guilty of such enormities were impelled by their slavery to pleasure. And we all accuse the Cretans of concocting the story about Ganymede that's has to do with Zeus, because it was their belief that they derived their laws from Zeus. Zeus came and fetched Ganymede. Dr. Keener talked about this last week. Had sex with Ganymede, and then, of course, made him the wine pourer and all that in Olympus. They added on to this story about Zeus in order that they might be following his example and enjoying this pleasure of male with male as well. So they want to mimic the gods, and so they concocted this story. So not only does Paul quote the Cretans who think they're all liars, Plato says we all accuse the Cretans of making up stuff. So there you go. A little bit of Titus for you thrown in the mix in this Romans conversation.
So, I mean, I think I heard, maybe I misheard, but I think I heard somebody bring up the fact that could have been some ancient or spiritual cosmic powers that the people were being handed over to, right? I think the word where it says that God gave them up, paradokin, and
paradidomi, the verb,
okay, God handed them over to impurity. So a lot of times when we see that word mentioned, in the Septuagint in the Old Testament, normally is when God is dealing with his people and they're being handed over to enemies. And so within this whole passage of scripture, we see a certain exchange. We see the exchange of the knowledge of God. We see the exchange of the worshiping of God to worship idols. Paul says elsewhere in his writings that the idols are really not idols, but they're demons and things along those lines. But we're seeing that the fruit of this type of exchange, and this is in response to the hypothetical interlocutor that would say, well, homosexual sex is not sin per se, but it's degrading passions and things like that. Even if you want to take that route, it is the byproduct of God's judgment. And that cannot be said to be a good thing. It's the byproduct of that exchange. It's the byproduct of idolatry. It's the byproduct of worshiping false deities.
Well, you also have the interesting aspect of that. Paradidomi is used in 1 Corinthians 5, specifically in the case of the curious case of the incestuous man, where it says you are to deliver or hand this man over to Satan for the destruction of the flesh. And so paradidomi often occurs in that sort of kind of active passive idea of getting someone out of the church so that there might be salvation on the day of the Lord, so that the church can survive will survive the judgment of God. And so I'm preaching through Revelation right now. I'm looking at chapters 2 and 3 at the letters to the churches, and I'm like, ooh, some of the churches around us, you might want to read some of those letters and talk about compromise and sexual ethics before he takes the candlestick away and the light away from y'all. But I think that's a good point, because you got the language of deliver or hand this man over to Satan, get him out of the church, expulse him, and deal with it that way. And so being handed over to malevolent powers, or you're debased, or to sin, capital S, sin. I mean, it's you went from the freedom of Christ and the freedom of Eden into enslavement and abuse and degradation and dehumanization. And now you call it good. And as our friend up in the corner says, you're now in Plato's cave, because Plato's cave is normal and sin is now the normal thing. And that's why the light of Christ is so important. That's why Romans 7 becomes actually very interesting. If you read Romans 1 and Romans 7 together, you get a very interesting just kind of dynamic at play theologically.
Wow.
Of enslaving powers and stuff.
Yeah, really, in Romans 5, that comes out to the forefront too. So, as far as these arguments that Paul's not condemning like monogamous homosexual relationships, just these arguments, it's all about pederasty or whatever, or it's only heterosexuals acting contrary to their nature. These arguments are so thin that I don't know why. I mean, you have to.
It's an appeal to biblicists. It's trying to be biblicist to win biblicists over to your view. When in reality, I'm like, guys, just say Paul was wrong. Just say Paul was wrong.
Well, Marcus Borg did say Paul was wrong. That's what he said.
Yeah. Well, Marcus Borg says Paul was wrong. Richard Bell flat out says Paul is wrong. What Paul got wrong was on sexual ethics and all that sort of stuff. Most scholars, when pushed, go, yeah, Paul was wrong about Daniel Kirk. Yeah, Paul was wrong. Like it's not a big deal for them. It's just people that want to trade off the biblicists, get the biblicists on their side, is so they argue like we would argue, and then even their contemporaries like, what the snickerdoodle are you doing?
My biggest problem with them is that it's half scholarship anyway. They try to go to ancient sources, but they never include all of the ancient sources because they know. I mean, it's like you can go to the Wikipedia page if you wanted to. I mean, it's Sporus. They knew what gay marriage was. Nero
they had it back then, I think.
Yeah, Nero married a dude. Cut his stuff off, you castrated him and married him and paraded him around because he reminded him of his wife that he either died of childbirth or kicked to death, whichever legend, story you believe from the ancient world.
Oh boy, it sounds a lot like today, honestly, that brutalization of people.
Yeah. And so, I mean, it's like Paul would have been aware of all of these kinds of things, just like the broader Greco-Roman culture, which, like you mentioned before, Nick, mimicked ours. But what he kept, it was strict Levitical language, as Will pointed out. This is condemning all the activity for both men and women. Doesn't matter, and there's no getting around it. And it's not like the church. I mean, I understand, even like I said earlier, even when conservative pastors preach, sometimes they try to shy away. We all remember the famous J.D. Greer thing. Well, the Bible only whispers about it, and we should shout.
It's a loud whisper.
Yeah, it's a very loud whisper. And this idea that, well, there's Paul would be okay with certain things. No, because that would, again, mean that Paul would be okay with certain kind of
Paul hates abuse. Like Paul hates power hungriness in his churches. He condemns it. Yeah. Jesus condemned it. You see how the Gentiles lord it over you, act like despots and tyrants over you, how they manipulate you and brutalize you and abuse you. That's not what you're supposed to be. The church is not about that. And yet we want to make it about that.
And a progressive would say, amen, Nick, but that's the only kind of homosexual behavior Paul's condemning, is just those power dynamics and not all of it. And I'm saying, no, that doesn't hold up either. It's yes, and it's not, it's
the one argument. Sorry, Will, I've been talking. Go ahead.
No. Well, I just want to say, like, Braxton has said this. He's not here, and I think I saw someone in the comments call him Brax Attack, which I just thought was hilarious. But one thing Braxton I've heard him say on the channel, and I'll speak for him in this situation, which is simply like, no one says you have to be a Christian. Mm-hmm. No one says that you have to believe the Bible. No one is saying that you have to. We're saying that we think Christianity is true and you ought to be, but no one says you have to. So how about instead of trying to twist my religious tradition,
colonize
and the Jewish religious tradition.
You are trying to colonize my Jewish scriptures.
That is so good. Yeah. So I'm trying to colonize my first century Jewish religion. And because that's what you're doing. No one is saying that you have to believe this stuff. But I'm just saying, if you affirm Christianity, that Christ rose from the dead, or if you just believe in general Judaism that, your God is one and that you're still waiting for the Messiah, either one, then the teaching is the teaching, man. That's what the religion teaches. Just like the Quran also has very strict teachings on various different things. I'm not going to Islam saying that they need to change this and this and this, and they've really misunderstood the Quran. I'm saying that, hey, I think Islam is wrong. You should become a Christian. I'm not going to try to twist their holy book.
The one argument I really found, aside that had initial teeth with me, was Paul was a misogynist. And it's a fairly famous argument that has some teeth to it until you realize that Paul wasn't a misogynist. But it's kind of that idea, well, Paul's putting down women, Paul's putting down this, men are doing this, and we all know Paul hates women because have you read the Bible? And it's like, well, if you read Paul's sexual ethics in 1 Corinthians 7,
also an egalitarian text.
Well, not just an egalitarian text, but a text without a pretext. It's a text that has no parallel in the ancient world for its time. The idea that, your wife has authority over your body, exousiazo, has actual sovereignty over your body, and he has the sovereignty over your body, so neither has sovereignty over it. And that not only that, you are to not deprive one another, assuming that both parties engage in sexual pleasure and joy, which is contrary to Greco-Roman views of female sexual pleasure and agency. Do not deprive one another what is owed to the other in terms of sexual activity, except through mutual consent. So you both decide, and you do so through prayer. And, of course, it ends with a great declaration in verses 12 through 16 of, wife or husband, do you not know that you may save your husband or your wife? And so that relationship can have salvific attributes to it. But we forget that Paul's writing, the one or two texts in Paul that get all the love or hate, depending on how you feel about it, don't overshadow what he literally says about sex and sexual ethics all over his epistles. Paul is a radical sexual egalitarian, in contradistinction to Philo. So Paul is different from the Greco-Roman moralist, but he's also different from Philo because he doesn't read Genesis 1 through 3 in hierarchical or subordinationist terms. He reads it as a Jew, as a good Jew. This is what God desired for us: shared dominion over creation, making babies, households as family units, as making war together against the powers. Da 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 da. And so it's one of those where I just kind of sit down and go, if people had a more robust theology of baptism, pneumatology, and ecclesiology, we wouldn't be in this mess. And that's why I jokingly say egalitarianism done biblically leaves off all this progressive narcissistic crap. Sorry for the language, but it's just one of those where I'm like, guys, if you have a biblical sexual ethic and you're egalitarian, it solves literally all the problems. We have the best exegetical cookies on our side. We don't have to go down this rabbit hole. We don't have to colonize the text to make it say. We don't have to hate Paul. And Paul and Jesus look very, very similar. And Moses actually looks very, very similar. Indeed, they actually seem to be saying the same things. So it's one of those where I tell people, if you solve the debate on Paul and women, you've already solved the debate on Paul's sexual ethics when it comes to homosexuality and incest and all the other stuff. So that's just a joke I tell people, and they just kind of look at me like, what? Then I read them Romans 1, then Ephesians 5 and 1 Corinthians 7. They look at me and go, oh, well, that all shockingly fits together. So anyway, vent over. And I'm going to have to go in like 10 minutes. So if y'all want to keep talking, I'll shut up for that because I've talked way too much.
Well, so there's going to be time for me to speak? Wow.
I'm sorry, Chris. I apologize. I've colonized the time. I'm sorry.
Well, we've got verses 28 through 32. Does anyone have anything else to say on that hasn't been said already on the 26 and 27?
Or does Chris want to go start back at the very beginning and tell us his thoughts?
No, you guys covered it, fairly well. I guess the only comment that came to mind along the way that no one kind of mentioned, previously mentioned already, was really more when Pritchett, when you were talking about Greer, but you were speaking of something very specific. As I sort of, operate in sort of a pastoral role within my church. And so I recognize that when we are broaching these types of topics, there's there are like ideas that are out there floating around that I want to dispel. And I do recognize within our congregation's context that this has been such a taboo subject for such a long period of time that there's probably a lot of prejudices within our congregation that I want to kind of undo before we get into the affirming things. I feel like if you just go straight into affirming what we know the text says, it might feed some bad behaviors. So yeah, I think that the occasion of which you're going to be preaching this passage is a factor in how one might take an approach that might be slightly softer than what Paul is taking. Secondly, we just spent an hour plus talking about these couple of verses where this next cluster of scriptures equally condemns these other behaviors, and that's just something that Christians don't seem to necessarily we don't seem to operate in a sense that, or treat this second list, this broader list, the same way we treat that one. We treat it as uniquely special, and I'm not sure that that's an appropriate thing to do. So it's not necessarily.
I actually disagree with you, Chris, because what I see is people who want to rush through 26 and 27 so that they can get to 28, so that they can escape all of
Pritchett, they want to get to 2-1.
Fair enough, but they want to get they want to soft pedal 26, 27 and get into 28 so that they can divert attention from what they just had to say that they tried to play down anyway. I think that's more I mean, if like whatever the preacher was that Will was talking about, sure, you can still find some fundamentalist churches that don't want to hammer on the vice list later in this chapter and want to spend all of their time on 26 and 27. But what we were doing is kind of apologetics and refuting certain arguments.
For sure. I know what we were doing. So
yeah.
And I wasn't, but I do think that's often what churches are doing. But maybe that's just, churches that I've kind of observed. I see almost this like, almost like an opportunity to virtue signal, to congregations versus have a robust expositional treatment like we're doing. I don't see this very often. This is helpful because we brought out a lot of contemporary cultural background, like other Jewish commentators, like contrasting it with the way that Greeks and other contemporary communities perceive these things. So I think that we did actually a really healthy thing today in the way we treated it. But from my experience, I see a lot of pastors that just go straight into this text, virtue signal to their community, and brush over what's next more often than I see pastors.
Pritchett, can I go? Can I go?
Softness, yeah.
Well, let me say just real quick.
No. I want to go. It's not fair. I haven't talked at all. I'm kidding, Pritchett. Go ahead.
Yeah. Well, I want to say there could be differences because I mean I would probably agree in like rural churches that back home in Arkansas probably do that. Now that I go to a larger church here in the city, we had our pastor on, but churches like that in these kind of contexts are probably more of the let's play down the 26 and 27 to not cause offense. Whereas in Nick's context out west, he's talking about all the neighbor churches out there who are trying to either twist this passage or reject it altogether. Yeah.
Well, I'm talking at the Southern Baptists who tiptoe around it or use it as fodder to actually show hatred to people, and the progressive churches who sit there and go, "This doesn't match with the sign and flag we have on our church." So,
yeah, but
I'm caught between both of them.
I do go down to Metropolitan on occasion because I love Dr. Adrian Brooks, but I don't spend a whole lot of time in black churches, so I wouldn't know how these texts are approached in that context either. So you might
black churches are very direct. Like traditionally speaking, they don't. This isn't a passage they struggle with. They've had.
Richard, have you ever preached in a black church? Because within 5 seconds whether or not anything you say lands. It's like,
yes, I have.
Dude,
Nick, amen.
Well,
do I have a quick story?
Yeah, but I'm saying. Well, what I was saying, speaking to is, they're very direct about 26, 27, but I would say that they also would you say that in typical black churches they would pull back on the vice list?
Not any church I've preached in or worked at or been around.
Now, any point that can be homiletically dramatized is a point that black pastors appreciate.
Yeah,
it's something I can, and you can kind of emphasize it in a way that kind of
come on now,
call and response nature of the black church. So yeah,
I don't think tonight, Chris.
No. Will wants to say something. I want to hear what Will say. Then I get to say my thing.
Okay, so basically what I was going to say, I used to actually go to a black church in Chicago. And no, I never heard of ever backpedal. In fact, whenever these sorts of things came up, it just turned full gas, and it was just awesome. But, no fear whatsoever. And usually they got a whole bunch of come on preachers, but I used to pastor a small church in West Michigan, which is like Dutch Central, like it's basically Holland from Europe,
Holland,
like
Grand Rapids.
Transported. Yep, I would pastor in Grand Rapids. Okay, so all Dutch people, and then this was my first pastor at my first year, and there's a lady in our church who was half black, and her dad died of suicide via heroin overdose. And she asked me to speak at her dad's funeral. And I was like, sure. And I didn't know all the family relations, but her dad was black. Apparently her mom was white. So it was actually a black funeral in this small country white town. And I'd never preached in front of a black crowd at this point ever. And it was just funny because I went up there and I was so used to like the Dutch crowd, which is like quietness promotes reverence. If you speak while the preacher's speaking, you're a disrespectful little turd. Do you understand? And then I get up there and I'm just like, I was trying to think like, how do you even talk? How do you even address the people with such a tragic death, like suicide via heroin overdose? And I was just like, well, let's not remember, because he was very influential. I was like, let's not remember how he died. Let's remember how he lived. That's kind of how I started it. And the whole crowd went wild. And it was just after that, it took me a few minutes to get used to the cadence. Like I would say a few sentences and they would respond. And I just said after that, I was like, I want to do that at every sermon. Like I want that level of energy every single time. It got me going, man. I was like, I mean, they were just all hooting. How it was awesome.
Y'all remember the joke from Scrubs when JD goes to a black church for the first time and he's like, "Oh, what's happening? What's happening?" Because they're all just dancing. It's like, oh, great skit. But yeah, some of the best preachers I know. Like I'm an okay preacher. I don't stand a candle to any of my African American friends who preach. Like I walk in their church and it's just, if it's an Orthodox church and they preach the gospel and they live the gospel, it's like the heart and the head meet, and the pulpit is an expression of the love of God with fury and thunder and lightning and power. It's a wonderful experience. But before I forget, I was struck by Chris. You pointed out something really interesting. I was struck by how Paul uses in chapter 1, verse 30. Slanderers, haters of God, or God haters, insolent, arrogant, and boastful. There's this word here that occurs once in the New Testament, inventors of evil. And I was struck by that because, Chris, you mentioned, a lot of people either softball the one passage and fixate on the one passage or vice versa. And I was reading that and I was struck by that. Inventors of evil is such a vague but targeted word. Inventors of, and it's in the plural, inventors of evil things. You know what I mean? And just the idea that people would go, I read that and I'm like, that the word for evil there is, wicked, wrong, bad, but occurs like it often has political connotations, crime, political decadence and corruption and stuff like that. I'm like, it's almost as if people will find a way to sanctify and baptize any sin as long as it privileges their money and their power and their wealth. I was reading that and I'm like, whoo, disobedient to parents, foolish, faithless, heartless, ruthless, and on and on and on it goes. I was like, that, I wonder how much love, quote unquote, that little line gets. Inventors of evil, that speaks to the creativity and depravity of humankind right there. And I was like, whoo, inventors of evil things. It's like, oh, you mean they're things we haven't made up yet? Oh,
well, we're seeing that now in our culture.
Exactly. Transing the kids.
Well, like I said, Nero more or less transed his sporus. So
yeah, but now with hormones.
Yeah,
just
true.
saying.
True. So verses 28 through 32, and they did not see fit to acknowledge God. The final God gave them up to a depraved mind to do things which are not proper. People having been filled with all unrighteousness, wickedness, greed, and evil, full of envy, murder, strife, deceit, and malice. They are gossips, slanderers, haters of God, insolent, arrogant, boastful, inventors of evil, disobedient to parents, without understanding, untrustworthy, unfeeling, and unmerciful. So that is Paul's vice list. Now, Paul, like the household codes, a lot of preachers will say, yeah, there are Greco-Roman household codes, but they'll never tell you what they are. So it was a week ago, last Wednesday, when I was teaching at church. I decided to show them some, and I want to. We like to go big here, so
so that's why you never called me back. You were actually at church. I'm actually not mad anymore.
I teach on Wednesday nights.
I know. I call you, not just on Wednesday nights.
So if you want to see some vice lists, both you find these in Aristotle, Plato, and others. I think Zeno has one. There's several of these. They also have some ones in the Old Testament even, and of course Wisdom of Solomon 11:15 through 16 has some. So just to anybody want to read any of these, just see that this type of style that Paul, the call of viceless, is we find several in Paul.
But I'll read the wisdom one at the bottom because that one's got some there. So, but for the foolish devices of their wickedness, wherewith being deceived, they worship serpents void of reason and vile beasts. Thou didst send a multitude of unreasonable beasts upon them for vengeance, that they might know that wherewithal a man sinneth. I'm just going to stop now. I'm going to ruin that. By the same also shall he be punished.
Right. Oh, I didn't add that as a viceless. I added that to show what Paul is it's the same principle of when God gives them over this. And it talks about the condemnation in verse 32. And although they know the ordinance of God, that those who practice such things are worthy of death, not only those, but also those who approve and practice of them. So what the author here in Wisdom, which Paul has echoed already in this text, and what Paul is getting at about what God giving them over to something, it's as if that is the punishment in and of itself. This kind of behavior compounding and the effects that it wreaks havoc on the good creation, that is in itself its own punishment, that the very things that you kind of defile yourself with is the very thing that does you in.
Well, and you got the language too here of, and since they did not see fit to hold God in knowledge or to acknowledge him. So I'm looking at, there's an interesting infinitive there, but it's active infinitive. Since they decided not to do something, God responds by handing them over into a debased or a failing or a worthless, spurious mind, doing things that ought not to be done, that are not fitting to be done. I just find, again, the element of human agency here seems very, very strong, that because you didn't decide to do something, God's like, fine, go do the thing you clearly want to do that I'm not making you do. If y'all know what I have in mind when I say that, peace be upon you.
Yeah. Well, Plato kind of picks up on that idea, similar idea as Paul, of course, from a different perspective, obviously. Paul's exchanging the truth for a lie. Whereas every act left its smirch upon its soul, where all is awry through falsehood and imposture, and nothing straight because of nurture that knew not truth, or as the result of unbridled course of fastidious insolence and incountenance. This is vices, right? And Aristotle, various emotions, for instance, caloric, insensitive, erotic, bashful, shameless, states of character are the states that cause the emotions to be present either rationally or the opposite. For example, the opposite would be the virtue list that Aristotle has here: courage, sobriety of mind, cowardice. What's that word? Profligacy? I don't know what that word means. But yeah,
profligacy.
Huh?
Profligacy.
Profligacy. Thank you. I don't know that word. I am okay pronouncing my ignorance on that particular word from Aristotle. Anyway, so Paul has a vice list, kind of echoing
reckless extravagance.
There we go. So Paul has his own vice list, and one of the things interesting is Keener breaks this down in his commentary, talking about this broadening of sin. So he's moved on from sexual perversions to more general categories, which again hints at why Paul can say you do the same things to the Jews. And he says it's filled with 4 basic evils, full of 5 sins. The 4 basic evils: unrighteousness, wickedness, greed, and evil. The full of 5 sins, the 5 sins being envy, murder, strife, deceit, and malice. And Paul does this for rhetorical purposes. And then he's a summary of 8 kinds of sinners. So he says these are the kinds of sinners. They are gossips, slanderers, haters of God. They're insolent, arrogant, boastful, inventors of evil, without understanding, untrustworthy, unfeeling, and they are unmerciful. So you would say unmerciful people. He says this is what they are. These are the kinds of sinners that they are. They are all of these kinds of things. Now, certainly in all of that, whether it's greed, evil, envy, murder, strife, deceit, malice. Everyone has become guilty of at least one of the 4 basic evils, 5 full of sins, or 8 summaries of kinds of sinners. 17 options here for of categories that somebody is going to fall into one of them.
Don't forget, Pritchard, you got a super chat.
Yeah, I've got it starred here from our channel Angel. I do super chats at the end just so that we can, and if anyone has questions, they can type question and then as the first word in all caps, and then I'll see that as well.
And make sure you tag Trinity Radio and put hashtag thinneth just to make fun of me, because apparently I'm silly with thinning.
That's all right. I'm having trouble speaking too. I can't even pronounce
reprobate. God gave them over to a reprobate mind.
Yeah, a reprobate. We got that. You have to say it like that too.
Reprobate.
There's some latent, there's some latent flowers for you. But yeah, so we have 17 things here that Paul. So this is longer than most of the vice lists that you'll find. It's not the longest in antiquity, but it is among the longest for sure. So Paul is not pulling any punches here either, and he's kind of sounding off. You know?
Yeah, it's one of those where I just kind of chuckle and I'm like, well, for all the stuff I say, I read these and I'm like, yeah, I've probably done quite a bit of this. And I'm sure I've done some of that very recently.
Yeah.
At least I don't know. I'm naturally introverted, so I read stuff like this. I'm like, yeah. I didn't need that word in my life right there, but salt on an open wound is a good thing. So
you're pretty boastful in our phone conversations for sure.
Does that miss the point? You kind of confessing the fact that you do some of these occasionally, because it seems to me that Paul is referring to a group of people who practice this sort of as a way of life. You know, these you were speaking earlier to the power dynamics. You know, and this the power people have the privilege of behaving in ways that are unbecoming, and they wouldn't want people to behave towards them. But in light of the fact that they're in the position to exploit, you know, they take advantage of it, whether they're just giving in to their nature as it seems. So I don't think it's necessarily helpful to say, yeah, I'm guilty of that, because I don't think that's the point that Paul is making. He's not talking about people in that circumstance.
I don't think he is. I'm saying existentially, like I can definitely see elements of myself in this, and that means this text is cuts. And I think, I'm not saying it's directed towards me, but reading that, I felt a bit of,
certainly prior to our conversion to Christianity, because Paul is leading up to condemn all of humanity, regardless of social status or gender. You know, he's trying to condemn everybody here. And
that's why he's hitting it with such a broad brush. He's striking all the sin.
Yeah.
Yeah, but I take Chris's point. He has a specific group in mind as representing all this, who are fulfilling this or being filled in the dishonor of all of this. For me, it's more an existential thing, as someone who is constantly thinking inside my own head. It's like, oh boy, I've done that. I've done that recently. I've felt like that, oh boy. Okay. Yeah. I too can very easily fall into that. And it doesn't take a lot to fall into that, specifically.
No, it doesn't.
I don't think I am as all of this is, because I've, the mind of Christ, I have the power of the Spirit and all that sort of stuff.
The flow of humanity, including Israel, by the way, which resulted in their captivity, is that when you exchange that truth for the lie, when you try to seek out that which is contrary to God through sin and idolatry, this is what humanity becomes. Mm-hmm. And
I just see it as a Romans 8 thing, being convicted by the Holy Spirit. When I read that, I'm like, oh, maybe that was for them, and it's also for me. Keeps me aware.
Yeah, and we find all of these vices in our culture too. And yes, it is possible, though not the purpose of Paul's point here, but it is possible that even believers have to watch out for this kind of behavior too, because we can still fall back into these traps.
Well, gossips, slanderers, that's Corinthians right there. That's Corinth right there.
Right.
So, but I mean, I take your point though, Chris. Yeah. So I personalize it as just a personal thing, not as a thing I would apply to other people who are not a part of it.
Yeah.
If that makes sense.
No, I got your point. I was more speaking, just kind of like, hey, the text isn't talking about Corinthians is talking about situations like you're talking about. This text is talking about something a little different.
Right.
About the people who are full-fledged into these type of behaviors and without the presence of God sort of guiding them or guiding their actions.
Right.
Captive,
these are the people that have
sexual immorality by the power of Satan.
Yeah, these
Thankfully,
are the
I'm not captive to that.
Yeah, these are the people who have shunned what they know of God, suppressed it in unrighteousness, God giving them up, okay, you're going to suppress his truth. So have at it. And this is how they find themselves in. And of course, when that becomes prevalent in the culture, that is what other people adopt. And that's it goes back to even what God said in Israelites, visiting the iniquities upon the generations, because when you hate God like that, I mean, this stuff becomes more increasingly prevalent, and you can see that happen in what has been termed a post-Christian America, regardless of how Christian America ever was. I have my doubts.
Thank you for clearing that up for me, because I get cynical every time someone says
I'll just say right now, the difference between Nero and Joe Biden is that Joe Biden was democratically elected.
Yeah.
Well,
he doesn't.
The Roman Empire and all of that.
Castrate a boy either and marry him.
Well, we don't know that.
Give him a little credit.
Well, but in terms of empire and power and
people
status
have
and
their theories, though.
Economics and greed and corruption, I'm like, we ain't that different. And given time and technology, I'm sure we'll be a lot better at being bad than they ever could have
like
thought.
America, like if you listen to a lot of the founding fathers, and if you just go to the East Coast, what you'll see is a lot of Rome. You'll see like lots of statues of Roman gods, and we admired Rome and we modeled our representative republic after them. It's no surprise that we turned out pretty much like them.
Well, here's the good news, though. Christianity became the dominant religion in the Roman Empire, and then Gibbon blames that on why Rome collapsed. So once again, we are five men thinking about the Roman Empire, because there's like a meme going around about how often men think about the Roman Empire.
We're reading Romans, okay, but also
right.
We have to, but also I do think of the Roman Empire pretty regularly.
I preach on it literally every Sunday when I read the Book of Revelation. So,
see, there you go.
Well, that's an anti-imperialist screed, really.
Dang right it is.
So I mean, you kind of have to think about it. But yeah, I mean, however much or however little, people want to talk about this being a Christian nation. We're certainly not now. And I hate this, I know people bag on Obama for saying however much we were a Christian nation, I kind of sound like, but it's kind of right. But I think people wish to believe ideally that we had that kind of background. But I mean, I always like what, his name is escaping me. He wrote the introduction or the foreword to The Hobbit. Who am I thinking of?
Wrote the foreword to The Hobbit.
Thaddeus Bumblesnatch. I don't know.
No, that's not his name.
Forward to The Hobbit?
Yeah,
Tolkien's work?
Yes. Where he said the 50s were no fouler than the 60s. The 60s were no
Tolkien?
Huh? No.
Tolkien? Okay.
That's the son.
Christopher Talking. Christopher took a token.
Christopher Tolkien.
Ignatius putting tokens.
I can't remember his name. Anyway, he said that people always have this ideal version of the 1950s where they said that, the 50s is the golden age that people want to hearken to go back to. But he had wrote that the 60s were no fouler than, and people say the 60s was the horrible decade, but he said the 60s were no fouler than the 1950s. It's just that the 60s reaped the foul harvest of the 50s. And I thought
we were lynching people not 100 years ago in this country legally.
So it was Christopher Tolkien, by the way. Apparently in the new editions, there's a foreword by Christopher Tolkien, his son. I did not know that.
I just Googled it. That's how I found it out. That said, to me, this is, and I think Nikki would agree. Like this is the nature of empire. Empire, empire finds, collects like or establishes a set of romantic notions that they feel like they're aspiring to or that represent who they essentially are, and then they just live out values that are completely inconsistent with it, and they just obliviously ignore the fact that they don't live up to the virtues that they're espousing. Rome considered itself we're peace, and then Rome thought of themselves as so powerful and so great. We're eternal. Nothing's ever going to undermine or supplant us, because that's just the nature of man. So when we talk about America, America's just the latest country, and I don't live in China, but like I do these little social experiments when I'm on universities and I work with a lot of international students and engage with a lot of international students. I'm like, so is there like patriotism? And they're like, yeah, we got a lot of national pride for where we come from. And virtually every person from everywhere that I've asked that question seems to affirm, yeah, I have national pride for where I come from. And sometimes you'll just think like, wow, it's amazing, because my perception of that place is maybe not the greatest. So
yeah. Speaking of empire, it was Peter S. Beagle, and he wrote a book that also is on my shelf that I forgot. But speaking of empire in America, Peter S. Beagle wrote this in the foreword to The Hobbit back in 14 July 1973. He says the 60s were no fouler than a decade than the 50s. They merely reaped the 50s foul harvest, but they were the years when millions of people grew aware that the industrial society had become paradoxically unlivable, incalculably immoral, and ultimately deadly. In terms of passwords, the 60s were the time when the word progress lost its ancient holiness and escape stopped being comically obscene.
That's a good boomer right there. I like him.
Yeah. I always think about that, and we think about where America is and what progress has come to mean as opposed to what it should mean. We kind of see a lot of the Roman Empire now that this letter and this if you want to call it this anti-Gentile polemic or even screed, it's just as fitting now, and we do see that Paul concludes this section by talking about how awful people are, that they know the ordinance of God. They know it. He returns to this idea that although they knew God, now he says they know the ordinance of God, that those who do these things are worthy of death. And that, of course, is an echo of the original death that Paul will highlight more in Romans chapter 5. I think he's putting down a marker here. Just as death was the result of the fall of Adam, so death is a result of this decline of civilization, as you call it, Nick. Says that's what they know, that what they're doing is death. And of course, Peter S. Beagle just said, yeah, this kind of immorality, speaking about the 50s even, that the 60s became because of the 50s, and then now here in 2024, that it's deadly, and in theological terms it's worthy of death, because not only do they do all of this, but it's approved of by society, and we live in a society that approves of just about all of these vices that we see in this vice list. I mean, we have shows named after gossip. We have boastful arrogance everywhere, disobedience to parents. That's never goes out of style.
That's a good Friday night in the South right there.
Yeah. So, final thoughts. We'll go around the table, and then we'll let our viewers. We'll do the super chats and stuff, and then we'll get out of here. Well, who wants to go first? Some pastoral wisdom from the pastors, but MJ, you look like you're ready to.
Sure. This is an important text, and I think Paul is trying to let us know what happens when God is dealing with sin, so to speak. when there is an exchange for the way of God, for the way of the world, there are certain things that take place, and Paul does not shy away from those things, and neither should we. We should preach the word of God flat-footed, but we should take the time to teach it. We should take the time to disciple. We should take the time to build relationship with people as we teach these things in a loving fashion. Nevertheless, where there is false teaching, and we were interacting, with some of the different views of interpretation. I mean, let's just keep it real. We do have to deal with those views and engage the logic of those interpretations. So, spiritual warfare at the same time.
All right, let's not all jump up at once. Okay, so my final thoughts is the fact that I think we need to be respectful of the text and respectful of the historical data. We need to just accept that Romans 1 says what it says regarding same-sex relationships. I think that that's just something that it gets increasingly under my skin. But the other thing is it's us taking in the seriousness of what it is to live in sin and live in rebellion, to the death that it brings. Because it doesn't just bring death physically or damnation, so to speak, but it brings about chaos and hell in people's own lives. It brings destruction in our own lives. It reaps death in relationships and all those areas that actually impact us on a day-to-day life. So I think if we really want to take the rest of what the letter of Rome to the Romans seriously, we need to accept that. And as MJ just said, also approach this with love and care, because the world really does need the message and needs to realize that we are becoming or have become Rome, and Rome did fall, and we need a restoration and a revival on what is a proper ethic, a proper morality, and a proper something that's transcendental and above that which is our most base desires. We need something above all those things to aspire to.
Paul is looking at his contemporary society's culture and critiquing it in light of this meta narrative of the Jews that had preceded it. If you're not looking at or reading the book of Romans in light of its historical context, it's easy to get lost. It's easy to find pet topics or things that we have prejudices about, and to take exception, to argue against Paul, to miss what Paul is attempting to do. God wants all of us to flourish. There are certain behaviors that undermines human flourishing. They're cultivating anti-human flourishing, and Paul is setting the stage for moving into the rest of what he's setting the stage to express the fuller picture. So be patient. Don't let your pet frustration or your pet disagreement pull you away at this point. Stick to it. Listen. The story gets better.
Yes, and we'll get to that story soon. Nick, did you have something you wanted to say?
Yeah, one, subscribe to everyone's YouTube channel.
Yeah,
it always helps out, But one of the difficult things about this text is that it's very easy to isolate it from the rest of Romans. It's very easy to use it as an actual clobber tool, as the famous thing goes. But it's if you understand what Paul is doing, you've got this you have tragedy personified through dehumanization, destruction, and death. And the good news that began in verse 1 and following is that Jesus Christ is Son of God in power, resurrected over all things, and calls you to live in the lordship that only he can provide, in the love that he can provide. And so the solution that Paul offers to this sin begins with the resurrected Lord over all creation. It doesn't begin with Caesar. It doesn't begin with Greco-Roman values. It doesn't begin with pride flags or American flags or bombers or military might or power. It begins with the crucified, slain Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world. And that through belief in his name, you too can have your sins taken away from you through the waters of baptism, through confession and forgiveness. And that from a pastor to other people, you speaking to folks that are enslaved, not only are you enslaved, you're part of collateral damage in Satan's war against God. Like, I truly believe that. You are mired in sin, you are oppressed, and the gospel is emancipation and liberation. As God shattered Pharaoh and brought the slaves out of Egypt, he wants us to remember that we too were slaves. We were broken, we were oppressed, we were dehumanized. And our goal is not to dehumanize people, but call them into perfect union with Jesus Christ as their Lord and Savior. And that through forgiveness and redemption, you can have righteousness, you can have Christ, you can have the Spirit, you can have a family that loves you, that cares for you, that wants you to put to death the deeds of the body and to find true happiness, which at the end of the day is not about happiness, it's about joy. The Christian life is about joy, not happiness, at least happiness isolated. And so we bid you, as the Church of Jesus Christ, come and die in the waters of baptism so that Jesus Christ might be magnified in you and you might feel the gift of the Holy Spirit and take that gift wherever you go. And may you be blessed by that. And that's, I think, what we offer. We don't offer a text of condemnation. We already know what condemnation feels like. And I'm sure you do too.
Yeah,
come feel the gospel. Come feel the gospel.
That's kind of goes back to Paul's point, echoing wisdom of Solomon. The giving up is when you engage in this idolatry instead of worshiping your creator. The behavior itself, the sinful actions become their own punishment in this life. And of course, there is also ultimate day of wrath that we'll be talking about next week. But
hey, Pritchett.
Yeah.
Someone made a comment. Can I answer it real quick?
Which comment? From
Rev Ron. He says, so what are you saying, Nick, is liberation theology? No, it's not. It is the story of Exodus, the story of exile, the story of Jesus Christ being the liberator of our souls out of the bondage and slavery power of sin and death. And I'm not a Pelagian as well. No, I'm not a Pelagian, nor am I a liberation theologian, but I do believe in the liberating power of Jesus Christ's resurrection and the working of the Holy Spirit in our lives to destroy the power of sin and death.
My answer,
Amen.
My answer to that is I'm not a Pelagian, though I've been called one before simply by...
So I should say, yes, I am a liberation theologian, but it is a biblical theology of liberation.
Yeah, I've been called a Pelagian by some ornery Calvinists in a debate once. But
Ron, I'm sorry. You said #sarcasm. I'm sorry. My bad. So I do not retract what I said, but I apologize for missing the sarcasm. My bad. I want to make it clear that I apologize for being a little extra snarky. I didn't mean to put that much sauce on it. So my bad.
It is for freedom that Christ has set you free. So I'm as a liberation theologian as Jesus and Paul, who will get into the Exodus in Romans 9. But, Nick, you put that so well that I don't have much to add except for going back to the J.D. Greer thing and the discussion that we had about how to preach this passage or teach it. I agree with MJ that it's okay to do some expository teaching in the pulpit as well as preaching so that you can break this stuff down a little bit to help the congregation see where Paul's going. One of the things, if you're following us week to week, what I've tried to do is I've tried to read Romans every week so that I have the whole flow of it, because we can only do this or we'd be here for weeks ourselves talking this stuff out. So we can only do this in bite-sized chunks, but try not to lose sight of the whole of the text and where Paul is going, because it's not even about the condemnation as much as it is the apocalyptic revelation of Jesus. Chapter 3. So keep the Ben Witherington described this in his commentary about Romans 9, but it applies to the whole book. About it's like riding a bike, and if you lay off the pedals, you for too much, you might lose control of the bike and fall off. So you've got to do this, go all the way through the text to the very end. Romans does have 16 chapters, not 8, not 9, or not 11. It has 16. And so we try to keep the whole in view, try to keep the stuff that we talked about in the introduction in view as well. Now, we did have a question, but I don't think this was really for anybody on the panel, because I don't think any of us brought up studies that show higher abuse, that abuse is higher in lesbian. Did somebody say that and I wasn't paying attention?
Someone in the comments.
I said it in the comments because he's been arguing for pro LGBT stuff. He's like, there's no death at all, and there's nothing bad essentially about these relationships. Like, well, actually, there are studies that show this stuff. Now, people don't have to like it, but the studies do show these things. He's asking what studies because, hey, man, you can go Google it. It wasn't even like a conservative Christian thing that came up with it. They did a whole study on this sort of stuff.
Well, the CDC has stated that 43.8% of lesbian women reported experiencing physical violence, stalking, or rape by their partners. The study notes that out of the 48...
I'm just saying, I used to be a cop, and yeah, it gets pretty ugly.
Yeah, the CDC
Back to blue, y'all.
Yeah, the CDC. Well, my son is a police officer, and he won't even tell you to just uncritically back the blue. He'll tell you.
I know, Pritchett. Come on, like I act. Back to blue, yo.
Yeah, so it's one of those things that just gotta be mindful of. And of course, our channel angel Jim Amberg with $20 says, "I am enjoying these deep, in-depth discussions. Keep it up, guys. We intend to. The panel may rotate from week to week, but
y'all throwing gang signs up now.
I will probably always have.
It's the only signs I know.
Yeah. This is the 2 weeks in a row Braxton has fell on us.
Whatever Cartman said. West Side.
Come on. All right, well that does it for us tonight. Nick, what are we talking? How are we breaking this up next week? I
don't.
Are we going through verse 11? Are we going through verse 16? Are we going?
I'd end it at verse 11, so we're not trying to eat an elephant in 2 hours.
I hear you. So yeah, we'll go from 1 through 2:11. Take off that. That's still a big shot. There's a lot there to unpack, and so that'll be a lot of fun. We'll go through chapter 2 and work our way through. But hey, guys, it only took us if you count the introduction, it took us 5 weeks to get through chapter 1. So
dang, it's been 5 weeks already.
5 weeks already. This is
4 sermons to get through Revelation 1 through. Oh gosh, no, this will be 4 sermons to get through Revelation chapter 1. I'm still probably not going to get through it.
Yeah, I'm glad I tried to go faster than that when I preached. I know some preachers like to go verse by verse a week, and I'm just like, no, we can't do that.
Well, I did a Bible study in the book of Revelation where we covered the whole thing in 10 weeks. Never again.
Never again, huh? Well, Romans is going to take people who do Romans and they don't try to do chapter 16 in 1 week, which I don't think you can do if you dig into that either. Romans is going to take a while. So strap in, and we appreciate everyone who came to watch this tonight. And we'll appreciate you coming back to start chapter 2 with us, and subscribe to the Church Split, subscribe to the Urban Christian Institute. I got it right tonight.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Subscribe to and the MJ. Your channel also has Chris, because Chris doesn't have his own channel. So, but you can see Chris.
It's Chris' channel as well. He's might as well be the host as well.
Well, now you're taking away his thing where he says I don't have my own channel for a reason.
Well, he's going to have to stop saying that.
And of course, if you haven't subscribed to Trinity Radio, please do, because we will see you next time on Trinity Radio.
How long are you going to keep me doing this, Pritchett?